1918, here's another watershed. And it's a huge watershed moment. I mean, giant watershed moment. We have the definition of reform means restraint. But remember, reform means restraint when the economy is booming. What does it mean? Let me rephrase that. What does restraint mean when the economy is in a terrible condition? I shouldn't say it that way. How about this? How can you describe restraint if you are on the opposing political party? Coolidge and Hoover, and just to make sure you understand, Hoover was extraordinarily popular in 1928. He won by a huge landslide, mostly because he was seen as a humanitarian. Do you remember why he was seen as a humanitarian? What did he do? He was responsible for the American Red Cross feeding most of Europe after World War I, 1920. He was responsible for that. It was that experience that gets him tagged to be the Commerce Secretary. Remember the guy who was helping trade? And so by 1928, under Coolidge, the economy is booming. Coolidge says, I'm not going to be president, because remember, 10 years is too long for anyone to be president. So Hoover gets the spot. Hoover gets elected by a landslide, and they look at him as a humanitarian. That's what makes him famous. Well, by 1932, the economy changes. You have to understand, you guys all know that the stock market crashed in 1929. You know this. But that doesn't mean that unemployment goes to the roof in 1929. It takes about 2 years. Because as we mentioned, stocks are just pieces of corporations. If people have their money invested in stocks, and then the stock market crashes, then they don't have any money, so they can't invest it in other things. If the banks had secured loans based off of money that was hooked on to these stocks, and the stocks go down, that means that the banks don't have as much money. And what happens if all the people who have accounts in that bank decide to go in on the very same day to pull their money? What's going to happen? The bank is going to close. They don't have the money. They say, I'm sorry, we'll send you a check, $5 to the, or 5 cents to the dollar, or something like that. And they're out. And that's how it really affects. And if you lose your money, actually lose, you don't have access to money, then you can't be buying anything, consumer society or no. If you don't buy anything, what about all the other companies that didn't have a shot in the stock market crash? They're not being able to sell things. Their economy goes down. They have to lay off workers. That's kind of the process. But it's not an overnight process. It does not begin to show itself until late 1931. Early 1932. That's when we begin to see significantly higher rates. Up until then, what do you think is most concerned? What is the biggest concern for Hoover? What are people talking about? If you were to go into a newspaper, and you can do this actually in our library, it's actually fascinating. I used to teach a class called Post-45, United States since 1945. One of the things we would do is we go and I would print out newspaper covers from 44, 45, 48. You actually see what a newspaper was, right? If you look at the newspaper headlines, in 1928, 1929, 1930, even most of 1931, what's going to be on the headlines? What's the main topic?
Economy.
Not economy. Crime, prohibition. Those are the big issues. Remember St. Valentine's Day Massacre? What was that? Chicago, beer wars. Prohibition was supposed to cure vice, but the problem was that a lot of these people in the urban areas for immigrants didn't think alcohol was really related to vice. Most of prohibition was passed by people that weren't in the urban areas. But you got more non-urban areas than you have urban areas in terms of votes, and certainly in terms of states. And so you got people that say, I don't really care, it's not a big deal, I'm going to be drinking. And the law says you can't manufacture or sell alcohol, but what didn't it say?
Consume.
You can't consume it. So I've got gobs of money because the economy is booming, gobs of money. I want to kind of live on the crazy side of life sometimes. You guys may understand that. So I'm going to go down to an illegal bar. I'm going to buy alcohol. If it gets raided, who gets busted?
The producer.
The guy who's selling. I don't get busted. It's embarrassing, but I don't get busted. And so we have a transfer of wealth from the above ground to the underground. A transfer of wealth from the legal economy into the black market economy. That's why the gangs get to be so powerful. They've always had gangs, but there's more money now. And so if there's money at stake, what are the gangs doing? They're fighting. Lots of crime. You guys don't know this, but in 1930, the little eaglet died. Who's the little eaglet? Maybe 31, but I think it's 30. The eaglet. You guys don't know. Who was the guy who was the first person to make a solo airplane flight from the United States to Europe over the Atlantic Ocean? Charles. Boom! Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh was an absolute hero. You cannot understand how big of a hero he was. I mean, flat out. There were stamps with him on it. He was touring the country everywhere he went, ticker tape parade. Everybody loves him. Because he did an amazing feat. And it was kind of an American thing. He did this, right? Everybody was trying to get across and people were failing. He did it. He did it by himself. A solo flight. Unbelievably famous. Well, in 28 and 29, all this organized crime, not only does it have conflict over beer wars, but you just have other related crime. Extortion, racketeering, kidnapping. And his son, newborn son, when he had a baby, everybody in the world knew about it on every headline. His son was kidnapped. And as they were taking him out the second-story building, floor, through the ladder, he fell and died. Now, we didn't know it at the time, so they took off the baby, and they ended up throwing him in a ditch. And nobody knows where the baby is for 2 weeks. They think, well, these guys kidnapped him. Well, they did. But it's horrifying. How could Lindbergh be subject to crime, the little eaglet? Because he was the big eagle, the little eaglet, very sweet, but also unbelievable. The worry of crime is what dominates the headlines. In the end, Lindbergh ended up going to England. Big castle type thing with security all over has totally affected his life. That's what we were concerned about. What is one of the first things that happens when Roosevelt gets into office? Gets rid of prohibition. Now, oddly enough, Hoover and Coolidge are both on the hands-off things. But that tradition of laissez-faire didn't always apply to issues of morality or issues of kind of social order. Remember, we had antitrust, that's an economic issue, but we also had anti-slavery. And Coolidge, Hoover, both very strong progressives. They didn't want to get rid of prohibition. They thought this was kind of a solution. This is the way that you could have individual restraint. And if you really think about it, isn't that the definition of restraint? The virtue? I'm not going to be getting drunk every weekend. Although, oddly enough, we want the government to make it illegal for you not to get drunk every weekend. But Hoover didn't want to get rid of prohibition. That's what was causing everybody to be concerned. That's what he was focusing on. And then, boom, out of the blue, we turn around, and suddenly, overnight, the papers are talking about the economy, unemployment. There's no money. People are losing their houses. They begin to live on the streets. And you know this, if you've ever seen Annie, they kind of epitomize this. What do we call people that live in, I was going to say not slums, like tent cities, or live in little parks that have just, tar papers or someplace? What are they called? I'll say the word and you'll say, oh yeah, I told you what it was. Hoovervilles. guys heard of those? Yeah, Hoover bills. Now let's be really honest. Who called them Hoover bills? Yeah, FDR called them Hoover bills. Now we have here, reform is the definition defined by restraint. The economy is going under. And Hoover is doing what he can, but his philosophy is the federal government doesn't solve this. Who should be solving this? The local folks, the cities, the churches, they're the ones that should be solving this. It's not a federal issue. And if he's saying that, even though he gets elected as a humanitarian, what does Hoover have to say? All this stuff, you call it restraint, what do I call it? You don't care. You don't care that people, you're the guy who walks down the street, sees a dying person, and says, somebody else will take care of it. And in fact, that image is so graphic, it's one of the reasons why you think of it when we think of the Great Depression. FDR, in order to get elected, all he has to do, it's not hard, all he has to do is simply say, Hoover does not care. In fact, that whole philosophy of restraint means that he doesn't care. I care. And for me, reform is not about restraint. What is it? Action. And that's why his platform is New Deal. I'm going to give you all a New Deal. I am going to fix this. I'm going to solve everything. And the thing about FDR is that he really had no scruples about saying he's going to solve everything. I'm going to solve everything. Crime, no problem, I'll fix it. Unemployment, no problem, I'll fix it. You guys have a problem with unions, I'll take care of that. Any problem there is, I will fix it. Now, you have to understand, it's not just FDR being braggadocio. It's a completely different political approach. Reform means action. There's a problem, I will act. In the first 100 days, I'm going to do all these things. I'm not going to sit around. We're going to take all these experts that we've been talking about forever. We're going to put them into my office. We have the brain trust. Have you ever heard that? The brain trust. This is another FDR propaganda type thing. Just like we had a trust for economics, where we have a bunch of people that are trying to control the market, we're going to have a brain trust. All the smart people of the country are going to come together. We're going to fix this. Vote for me, we're done.
Like a think tank.
Like a think tank. Except they're in the government. Does FDR win? Yeah. By a landslide. So much does he win. And you need to understand why this is considered a watershed event. And I'm just going to, well, I'm not going to tell you at first. I'm going to give you a few seconds. Why is this a big watershed event? Is this familiar at all?
No.
These two separate ideologies, is this familiar at all? Okay. I don't like talking about modern things, right? Because it's a history class, it's history. And oftentimes, the things we talk about today, people 80 years ago had no concept of. And so it's inappropriate for us to take modern ideas and project them backwards. But it's perfectly appropriate to see some of these seeds that were 50 years ago and see them today. Do we see any of this type of stuff today?
Yes.
Oh, yes. It will define the rest of the century, and it's defined the first score of years of the 21st century. Go ahead.
Like socialist versus like Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump. Like
Yes.
healthcare is not my responsibility or
Very much so. What is, and I don't want to get into modern politics, but what's the biggest complaint? Why don't people like Trump?
because people think that he doesn't care.
He doesn't care. That he doesn't like poor people. He doesn't want to help them. Doesn't like anybody that's not, rich or white or anything. Now, is that true? I'm not going to get into modern things. But do you think Hoover really didn't care?
He did.
Of course First, he was elected as a humanitarian. But this is really important, and we're going to talk about this so many times in the next units. Perception. I'll even write this